She was 19 years old, and she owned nothing. Not in the way people say they own nothing when they mean they are between apartments or between jobs, or between the version of themselves they used to be and the version they are becoming. She owned nothing in the specific, literal weight of it in your hands way. A backpack, a duffel bag, a Folgers coffee can with a plastic lid that she had wrapped in 2 rubber bands so it wouldn't come open on the bus. That was it. That was the whole inventory of Wren Calloway's life on the morning she pulled the front door of her father's rented house, closed for the last time. She didn't slam it. She didn't cry. She stood on the porch for a moment, with her hands still on the knob, and looked at the door the way you look at something you are trying to memorize. And then she let go and she walked down the 2 steps to the yard, and she didn't look back. The street was quiet. It was early, not yet 7, and the light was that particular shade of gray gold that happens in Mississippi in late September, when the summer heat is finally starting to loosen its grip, and the air smells like cooling earth, and the last of the season's cut grass. A neighbor's dog watched her from a chain-link fence. A mockingbird was working through its catalog somewhere in the oak tree at the corner. Everything was ordinary. Everything was the same as it had been every morning of her life in this town. And yet the world had rearranged itself completely, the way it does after the last fixed point is removed. Her father had been the last fixed point, and he was gone. Calvin Calloway had died 11 days ago, sitting in his recliner with the evening news on and a half-eaten dinner on the tray table beside him. Wren had found him when she came in from her shift at the marine supply store. The television was still on. He looked peaceful. That was the thing people kept saying at the small, quiet funeral that followed. He looked so peaceful. And Wren had nodded each time because she didn't know how to explain that the peace on his face was not new, that her father had been practicing that particular stillness for 8 years, ever since her mother died, and that what she felt looking at him in that recliner was not shock, but rather the click of something finally finishing that had been in the process of finishing for a very long time. Her mother's name was June. She had died on a Tuesday when Wren was 11. Brain aneurysm. She had been making dinner and then she was gone, and the world divided itself permanently into before and after. Before, the house had been full of a particular kind of warmth that Wren would spend the rest of her life trying to describe and never quite getting right. It was the warmth of being known, of being seen completely by someone who loved what they saw. Her mother had been the kind of woman who noticed things. She noticed the way Wren held her crayon when she drew left hand curled around the paper in a tight, protective arc. She noticed that Wren always drew boats, not houses, not horses, not the princesses other girls drew. Boats. Always boats. Boats with crooked masts and stick-figure sailors and waves that looked like green hills. Boats heading somewhere with great determination, even though the somewhere was never shown, only implied. Her mother had saved every one of those drawings. Wren knew this because she had seen the folder in the kitchen drawer, a thick manila folder that got thicker every few months. She had been embarrassed by it as a child, the way children are embarrassed by evidence of their parents' love. She had never looked inside it after her mother died. She had assumed her father, in one of his slow, ember-by-ember retreats from the world, had eventually thrown it away. She found out she was wrong on the morning she packed up the house. She had been working through the rooms methodically, the way she did everything room by room, drawer by drawer, boxing her father's things for the Goodwill truck that was coming on Thursday, his flannel shirts, his collection of fishing lures he had not used in years, his reading glasses, 3 pairs, all slightly bent. She kept his old wool fishing sweater because it still smelled faintly of him. The specific smell of motor oil and Irish spring soap that she associated with the version of him that had existed before. She kept the framed photograph from the living room, her parents standing together at some summer gathering in 1998. Her mother laughing at something off camera, her father looking at her mother with an expression so unguarded and complete that Wren had never been able to look at it for very long. She was in the kitchen when she found the drawer. She almost didn't open it. It was the junk drawer, the one that exists in every kitchen and contains nothing useful, and yet accumulates everything that has nowhere else to go. Batteries of unknown charge, a broken watch, takeout menus from restaurants that had since closed. She pulled it open, expecting nothing, and found the folder. It was the same manila folder. Older now, the edges worn soft, the color faded from yellow to cream. She stood in the kitchen with the drawer open and looked at it for a moment, and then she picked it up and opened it. All of them were there. Every drawing she had made from the time she was 4 until she was 11, arranged in order, the earliest ones at the back, the later ones at the front. She could track her own development through them. The earliest ones were chaos, just colored marks that happened to suggest something nautical. By 6 or 7, the boats had real shape. By 9, she was drawing hulls with actual understanding, showing waterlines suggesting the way a vessel sits in relation to the surface it floats on. Her father had kept them, all of them. For 8 years after her mother died, in a kitchen drawer in a house he was renting by the month, a man who had gone so quiet that his daughter had stopped trying to reach him, had kept every drawing she had ever made of a boat. He had never mentioned it, not once. She stood in the kitchen for a long time holding that folder. Then she put it carefully in her backpack between her spare clothes and her copy of Chapman's Piloting and Seamanship, which was the book Roy Hatch had given her when she'd been working at his marine supply store for 6 months. She put it in gently, the way you carry something fragile. She walked out of the house with her bags and her coffee can, and she stood on the porch and she held the knob for a moment and she let go. The bus to Jackson left at 9:15. Roy Hatch had a face like a topographic map, deep lines running parallel across his forehead, deeper lines branching from the corners of his eyes, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something harder than bone. He was 63 years old, and he had been a Coast Guard rescue swimmer for 17 years, before a bad knee and a worse winter had convinced him to come ashore for good. He had opened the marine supply store outside of Jackson because he knew boats and he knew parts, and he had never figured out how to work anywhere that didn't smell like water. Wren had found him at 16 the way you find the thing you were always going to find. She had taken the bus an hour each way to work 3 days a week, and in the 2.5 years that followed, she had memorized every parts catalog in the store and learned everything Roy would teach her. Roy was not a sentimental man. He did not give compliments easily or often. But he had a brother named Corbett who ran a marine repair yard on the bayou outside of Houma, Louisiana. And Roy had said to Wren more than once that if she ever wanted to learn boats from the inside out, Corbett would teach her. He said it the way practical men say things that matter to them without emphasis, worked into the middle of some other sentence, so it didn't have to carry too much weight. Wren had filed it away and not thought much about it, until she was standing in the Jackson bus station with everything she owned in 2 bags and $1,128 in a Folgers can and nowhere particular to go. She bought the ticket to Houma. The ride south was long. Mississippi to Louisiana, the land flattened and the air changed, growing heavier and wetter, full of green thickness and heat that didn't belong to any particular season, but seemed to be the permanent condition of the place. The trees changed, oaks and pines giving way to cypress and tupelo, their roots standing in dark, still water, like the legs of patient animals. Spanish moss hung from the branches in long gray curtains that moved in no wind she could detect. She watched all of it through the bus window with the particular attention she gave to anything she was trying to understand. This was not a place she had been to before, but it was a place she recognized the way you recognize a word in a language you are just beginning to learn by its shape, by the way it sits in the mouth before you know what it means. She arrived in Houma at dusk. The bus station was a small concrete building beside a gas station on the edge of town. Corbett Hatch was waiting in the parking lot in a dented Ford F-25. Oh, that was the same color as old mud. He looked like Roy, the way a rough draft looks like a final copy. The same basic structure, wider in the shoulders, slower to move, with a gray beard that Roy had never grown. He held up a hand when he saw her come through the door with her bags. No wave exactly, more an acknowledgement. The way men who spend a lot of time alone greet the arrival of another person. He didn't say much on the drive out to the yard. He drove with one hand on the wheel and one arm resting on the door elbow out the open window and let the warm, wet evening come in around them. The road narrowed as they got further from town. The streetlights disappeared. The cypress trees closed in on both sides, their root systems standing in the black water of the bayou like an audience arranged just beyond the edge of the headlights. The repair yard came up suddenly in the dark. A wide wooden building open on 3 sides with a corrugated metal roof and fluorescent work lights that threw everything into sharp relief. A small dock extended from one side into the dark water of the inlet, and along the dock were tied 4 or 5 boats in various states of repair. A flat-bottomed aluminum skiff, a cabin cruiser with weed-streaked sides, a center console fishing boat missing its outboard, and at the very end of the dock listing perhaps 2 degrees to port an old houseboat. Corbett pointed at it without taking his eyes off the dock ahead of him. "That's the one I wanted to show you." She walked ahead of him to look. The houseboat was about 30 feet long. The hull was steel-painted white, originally now mostly rust, with patches of bare metal showing through in irregular shapes that looked almost geological, like exposed strata in a cliff face. The cabin sat on top of the hull, a flat-roofed wooden structure with peeling turquoise paint, and 2 small windows running along each side. A weathered wooden door faced the dock. An old orange life ring hung from the railing, the rope through it rotted down to a few strands still attached but barely. The whole vessel sat low in the water, weighted by whatever was inside it, and whatever water had found its way in through the hull over the years. It was a wreck. There was no other honest word for it. But Wren stood on the dock and looked at it for a long time, and what she saw was not only the rust and the rot and the listing and the deterioration. She could see the lines underneath all of that. She could see the hull shape low and wide, designed for slow water, for stability, not speed. She could see that the steel hull could be repaired. That steel was honest in that way that you could grind it down and clean it and build it back up and it would hold. She could see that the cabin, however rotted, was just wood, and wood was replaceable plank by plank, and that the underlying frame was probably still sound. She could see what this boat had been, and underneath that, she could see what it still was. "Whose was it?" she said. Corbett scratched his beard. "Man named Earl Fontenot. He passed last year. 88 years old. No family to speak of. Served in Korea. Came back and bought this boat in 1979 and lived on her ever since. Worked as a mechanic in Houma for 20 years, then retired and just stayed on the boat. People wondered where his money went. He spent almost nothing. Just worked and saved and lived small." He paused. Marina was gonna sell her for scrap. Back fees on the slip had been mounting up since Earl passed. I told them I'd hold her. The fees come to $10 even. You want her, she's yours. $10. Wren looked at the boat. Then she looked at Corbett. She set her bags down on the dock and unzipped the top of the backpack and took out the coffee can and peeled back one of the rubber bands and opened the lid and counted out 10 single-dollar bills from the roll inside and placed them in Corbett's open hand. He looked at the bills. He looked at her. He closed his hand around the money and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You know how to caulk a seam, yes. You know how to mix marine epoxy, yes. You know what you do if you find a hull breach below the waterline. Pump the bilge," she said. "Find the source. Patch from outside if you can reach it inside. If you can't, with thickened epoxy and a wood backer. Replace the backer once the epoxy cures." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read. Then he reached into the chest pocket of his work shirt and produced a key on a short length of rope and held it out. "Sleep on her tonight. We'll start in the morning." She took the key. The sun was almost down, the last light lying in long orange bars across the bayou, lighting up the undersides of the cypress branches from below. Wren walked to the end of the dock and stepped onto the deck of the houseboat, and the deck creaked under her feet and flexed slightly, but held. She unlocked the cabin door and pushed it open. Inside was a single room roughly 10 feet by 12. A built-in bunk along the starboard wall, the mattress blackened with mold and moisture. A small galley counter with a propane burner that had corroded to a solid mass of rust. A drop-leaf table and 2 folding chairs, one of which had lost a leg and leaned at an angle against the table. A few cabinet doors along the walls, some hanging open, one missing entirely. The wood throughout was swollen from years of humidity. The joints soft, the surfaces furred with the particular gray-green of long-term mold. The air smelled like water-damaged wood and old fabric and time. The specific smell of a space that has been holding on through seasons it was never designed for. She set her bags on the table and stood in the center of the room. Beneath her feet, the boat moved. Just barely. A slow, almost imperceptible rocking from the small wake left by something in the water outside. A fish, a turtle, a current. The movement came up through the soles of her shoes and traveled up through her legs and into her chest, and she stood there feeling it. And something happened that she would not be able to explain properly for a very long time. She felt held, not safe exactly, or not only safe, held. The way you are held by something that surrounds you completely, that matches your shape and accommodates your weight and does not require anything from you in return. She had not felt anything like it since her mother was alive. She stood there for a while. The light through the small windows went from orange to purple to dark. The bayou outside came alive with sound. Frogs beginning their low chorus. An owl somewhere in the cypress trees repeating its question into the dark. The slow, rhythmic lap of water against the steel hull. A sound like a clock that counted something other than time. She moved the rotted mattress against the wall and unrolled her sleeping bag on the bare bunk frame and lay down and looked at the ceiling in the dark. At some point, the fear she expected to feel did not come. What came instead was something quieter. Something she recognized from a long time ago from before. She lay in the dark on a boat she had owned for approximately 2 hours on a bayou in Louisiana, with everything she had left to her name in a backpack and a duffel and a coffee can. And she listened to the water against the hull, and eventually she slept. Corbett arrived at 6 in the morning with 2 coffees in styrofoam cups and a brown paper bag from a bakery somewhere down the road. He sat on the dock with his legs hanging over the edge, and Wren sat beside him. And they drank the coffee and ate without talking much and looked at the houseboat in the early light. The morning light did not flatter the boat. In the flat gray of dawn, the rust and the rot were fully visible, the listing more apparent, the overall condition more clearly dire than it had seemed the evening before, when the low light had softened everything. 6-month job if you do it right, Corbett said. Maybe more. Wren nodded. Where do I start, bilge? The bilge is the lowest interior space of a boat. The space below the cabin floor, where water collects and where things are stored that need to be kept out of the way. Every boat takes on some water. That is simply the condition of floating, the constant negotiation between the vessel and the element it inhabits. The bilge is where that negotiation happens at the mechanical level, where the water that gets in is collected and pumped out, where the health of the hull is most immediately visible. Wren lifted the hatch in the cabin floor and shined her flashlight down. The bilge was full of dark water about 6 inches deep, with a faint iridescent sheen from old engine oil mixing with it. The bilge pump was seized. She could see it mounted to the hull frame, corroded solid, the impeller frozen in place. She would have to replace it entirely. She got a plastic bucket and a coffee can, the empty one she'd cleared out that morning, and she began bailing, scooping water from the bilge and handing the bucket up through the hatch to dump over the side. The work was cramped and awkward. Her back bent at a bad angle, her knees against the hull frame. The water was cold and smelled like iron and old oil. She bailed for 2 hours. When the water was gone, she shined the flashlight into the bottom of the bilge and saw what was there. She went very still. It was a footlocker. Military issue, the kind that soldiers have taken to war since before her father was born. Olive drab wood with brass corner protectors, 2 leather straps running the length of the lid, a heavy brass padlock through the hasp. The whole thing was sitting on a platform of 2x4s that had been built up from the floor of the bilge, raising the footlocker above the waterline by about 6 inches. The platform was old, the wood gray and soft with age, but the footlocker itself looked intact. The brass was dark with tarnish but solid. The leather straps were dry and uncracked. The padlock was rusted completely shut. Someone had built that platform specifically to keep that footlocker dry. Someone had placed it here deliberately with care, and had factored in the water that would accumulate in the bilge over the years, and had compensated for it. Someone had wanted whatever was inside to last. Wren looked at it for a long moment. Then she climbed out of the bilge and went to find Corbett. He was in the yard working on the outboard motor from the fishing boat when she came around the corner of the shop building. She told him what she'd found. He put down his wrench and followed her back to the boat and looked down through the hatch at the footlocker sitting in the empty bilge. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said Earl Fontenot did 3 tours in Korea. Came back with things he didn't talk about. Lived on this boat for 40 years. Worked as a mechanic, spent almost nothing, saved everything he could. People in town used to wonder where his money went. He wasn't the kind of man you asked. He looked at the footlocker. I think we just found out where it went. They lifted it out together through the hatch. It was heavier than it looked. The kind of heavy that comes from density, from compacted weight, from a lot of small, heavy things in one place. They set it on the cabin floor, and Corbett produced a hacksaw from his belt and held it out to Wren. "It's your boat," he said. "You should be the one." She took the hacksaw and cut through the rusted padlock. The lock fell to the floor with a dull clunk. She unbuckled the 2 leather straps, the buckles stiff but functional, and she lifted the lid. And she stopped. She had not known what to expect. She had told herself not to expect anything. But whatever she had been preparing herself for, it was not this. Inside, arranged in careful rows on a bed of oilcloth, were canvas bags. Small ones the size of a paperback book, each one tied with a length of twine, and attached to each one with a small piece of twine and a paper tag was a date written in ink that had faded to the color of old tea. The earliest tag she could read said 1979. The next said 1980. They continued in order year by year across the rows. The most recent she could find said 2018. She lifted one of the bags. It was heavy. She untied the twine and opened it and poured a portion of the contents into her palm. Silver coins. Walking Liberty $50, their surfaces worn smooth with handling. Morgan silver dollars, heavy and dense. Mercury dimes by the handful, each one thin as a fingernail. Old silver, genuine silver, worth more than face value and accumulating in weight. She opened a second bag. More coins. A third held paper money, old bills folded in half and held with a rubber band. A fourth held a mixture of coins and bills. A fifth held only dimes. A sixth held only quarters, modern ones, clad not silver from years when Earl had perhaps run out of silver coins to save. She counted the bags. There were 43 of them. One for each year from 1979 to 2018, with 2 gaps, one in 1985 and one in 1992, years that, for whatever reason, had gone unrepresented. 40 years of saving. 40 years of whatever Earl Fontenot had managed to set aside each year from the life he had built on a 30-foot steel houseboat on a bayou outside of Houma, Louisiana. Some bags were light. The bag for 1981 was almost empty. Just a few coins and a single folded bill, as if that year had taken almost everything he had and left very little. The bag for 2003 was so full the seams strained, packed dense with bills and coins that shifted and settled as she turned it in her hands. At the bottom of the footlocker, beneath the last row of bags, lay 2 things: a folded American flag the kind given at military funerals, folded into a tight triangle, the white stars against blue fields showing at the top. The folds were precise, formal, each crease exactly where it should be, and an envelope, white, slightly yellowed, sealed, addressed on the front in handwriting that had the particular, deliberate quality of someone who has not written much by hand in a long time, each letter formed with effort. It said, "To whoever finds this." Wren looked at the envelope. She looked at the flag. She looked at the 43 canvas bags arranged in their careful rows. She looked at the bilge hatch in the floor, and through it at the wooden platform someone had built to keep this chest dry for as long as the boat held together. She was 19 years old. She had $1,118 left in her coffee can after the $10 she'd paid for this boat. She was sitting in the cabin of a rusted houseboat in a Louisiana bayou with her sleeping bag unrolled on a bare bunk frame, and no particular plan beyond the next 6 months of hull repair and carpentry, and learning whatever Corbett Hatch would teach her. And in her hands was an envelope addressed to her, not by name, not yet, but addressed to her as surely as if Earl Fontenot had known 40 years ago, or 5 years ago, or whenever he had written those words in his careful, labored handwriting that she was coming. That someone exactly like her was going to come down the dock one evening with a coffee can and $10 and ask the right question about the bilge pump, and that when they did, they would find their way to this footlocker, and they would be sitting here just like this with the envelope in their hands. She did not open it yet. She held it and felt the particular weight of a thing that is about to change you, that is already in the process of changing you, even before you know what it contains, just by virtue of existing, just by being here addressed to whoever finds this. Outside, the bayou had come fully into the morning. The bird sounds had shifted from the night chorus to the day chorus, different species, different frequencies. A transition so gradual you could not point to the moment it happened, but could only note afterward that it had. The water was gold where the sunlight hit it, and dark green where the cypress shadows fell. A great blue heron stood absolutely motionless in the shallows 15 feet off the bow. One leg raised its whole body, concentrated into the stillness of waiting. Wren set the envelope down carefully on the cabin floor beside the folded flag. She would open it, but not yet. First, she needed to sit here for a moment with the fact of it, with the 43 bags and the platform built to keep them dry, and the question of what kind of man spends 40 years putting things in bags and labeling them by year and hiding them in the bilge of a boat he lives on and writes a letter to the person who will find them someday. She needed to sit here and feel the boat moving beneath her. Just slightly. Just that slow, almost still rocking. The water doing what water does, negotiating gently against the hull, finding its level, carrying the vessel and everything on it, and inside it forward through time, at the speed of patience. She sat and felt it, and outside the heron waited, and the bayou light moved through the small windows, and the 43 bags of Earl Fontenot's life sat in their rows in the open footlocker, and waited too. She had been 19 years old for 3 months. She had $1,118 in a coffee can. She had a sleeping bag and 2 bags of clothes and a Chapman's piloting and seamanship, and a folder full of crayon drawings of boats that her father had kept for 8 years in a kitchen drawer without ever once mentioning it. She had a boat, and she had an envelope that had been waiting on a platform, built to outlast the man who built it, for whoever came. She picked the envelope back up. The envelope was not heavy. That was the first thing she noticed when she picked it up again. For something that had been sitting at the bottom of a footlocker for years, sealed and waiting, it felt almost insubstantial in her hands. A few sheets of paper folded. The kind of weight that has nothing to do with mass. She slid her finger under the flap. The seal had dried and come partially loose on its own, the way old glue does when it has been through enough seasons of heat and humidity. It opened without tearing. Inside were 3 sheets of plain white paper, folded in thirds, the handwriting the same careful, deliberate script as the address on the outside. She unfolded them and smoothed them against her knee and began to read. My name is Earl Fontenot. I was born in Cocodrie, Louisiana in 1930. I was the third of 5 children. My father worked the shrimp boats. My mother kept a garden so large it fed half the street. I left home at 17 to enlist, and I served in the United States Army from 1950 to 1953. Korea. I will not write much about that. There are things that happen to a man in a war that do not translate into words, and I have found that trying to translate them usually does more damage than leaving them alone. What I will say is that I came home in the summer of 1953 with a body that worked and a head that didn't not entirely knot in the ways it used to. And I spent the better part of the next 20 years figuring out how to live inside that. She read this slowly. Outside the bayou continued its morning business. The heron had not moved. I want to tell you about Clara Mayfield. She was from Thibodeau. We met at a church social in the fall of 1949 when I was 19 years old. And she was 18, and she was the first person I had ever met who made the world seem like it was arranged correctly. Like everything that had been slightly off-angle before was suddenly level. We were together for a year before I shipped out. I promised her I would come back, and I meant it. I believed it the way you believe things when you are 19 and have not yet learned what the world is capable of. I was gone for 3 years. When I came back, she had married someone else, a school teacher from Houma named Bernard. A good man by all accounts. She had not waited, and I could not blame her. 3 years is a long time to wait for someone who might not come back the same person he left as. I was not the same person. That is the honest truth of it. I tried for a while to be the person she had been waiting for, or the person someone else might wait for, but it didn't take. The noise in my head was too loud. The distance between me and other people felt too wide and too difficult to cross consistently. I was good with engines. I was good with my hands. I was not good at the things that require you to stay present in your own life long enough for another person to build something with you. I moved to Houma in 1962. I worked as a mechanic at a shop on the edge of town for the next 20 years. I was good at it. I was reliable. I showed up every day and I fixed what was broken. And I came home, and I ate alone, and I slept, and I came back the next morning. This is not a complaint. This is just what my life looked like from the inside. In 1979, I bought this boat. $400 from a man named Trosclair, who was leaving Louisiana for good and needed the money fast. The boat was in bad shape even then, but I could see what it was underneath what it had become. I put her in this slip, and I have lived on her ever since. Every year, starting in 1979, I put what I could save into a canvas bag, and I labeled it with the year, and I put it in this footlocker Some years there was not much. Some years there was more than I expected. I started doing it because I was saving toward something. I thought at first I was saving toward the version of my life that still might happen, toward the possibility that things might be different, that I might find a way to be the kind of man who could offer something to another person. I thought if I had enough money, if I had something to show for the years, I might be able to go to Clara Mayfield and say something that would mean something. She remarried after Bernard died. She moved to Shreveport. I read about it in the paper. I kept saving anyway. By the time I understood clearly that there was no version of events in which that conversation was going to happen, the saving had become the point. It was the thing I did. It was the shape of my years. Each bag was a year of my life. The material evidence of it, proof that I had been here, that I had worked and eaten and slept and gotten up again and done it one more time. I am not a religious man, but I think this was my version of prayer. Small and private and not addressed to anyone in particular. Just an act of faith in the continuity of days. I am 87 years old as I write this. I know what is coming and I am not afraid of it. I have had a long time to make my peace with the shape my life took. I do not think it was a bad shape. It was small and it was quiet. And it was mine. I do not have family. The men I served with are mostly gone. There is no one to leave this to in the ordinary way. So I'm leaving it to you. Whoever you are, whatever brought you here. If you found this footlocker, it means you came onto this boat for a reason. Maybe you needed a place to be. Maybe you were trying to build something. Maybe you were lost. I was all of those things at different times. I hope this helps. The boat is a good one. She has carried me a long way without ever leaving this slip. Some boats are like that. Some lives are like that. Take care of her. Earl Fontenot. May 2018. Wren read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and put it back in the envelope and set the envelope on top of the folded flag in the footlocker. She did not cry. Her throat was tight, and there was a pressure behind her eyes that had no outlet, a fullness that had nowhere to go. She sat with it. She thought about her mother making dinner on a Tuesday and then being gone by Thursday. She thought about her father keeping those drawings in a kitchen drawer for 8 years without saying a word. She thought about Earl Fontenot coming home from Korea in the summer of 1953 with a head that didn't work right, and spending the next 65 years in the territory of that damage, finding the shape he could manage, saving coins in canvas bags, labeling them by year, building a platform to keep them dry. She thought about Clara Mayfield, 18 years old, at a church social in 1949, who had not waited and could not be blamed, who had remarried and moved to Shreveport and never known that a man in Houma had been reading about her in the newspaper for 40 years and saving money in canvas bags in a footlocker in a bayou. She sat with all of it. She let it be what it was. Then she stood up and she went to find Corbett because there was a lot of work to do. Corbett knew a coin dealer in Thibodaux named Hargrove who had been appraising and purchasing old silver for 30 years. He came out 2 days later in a sedan that was too clean for the bayou roads and spent 4 hours at the table in the houseboat cabin, going through the canvas bags with a loop and a scale and a legal pad. He was meticulous and unhurried. and he gave Wren his honest numbers without embellishment or drama. The silver coins alone the walking Liberty halves, and the Morgan dollars and the Mercury dimes were worth considerably more than face value. The later bags held modern-clad coins worth only their face, but the earlier bags were dense with genuine silver from an era when coins meant what they were made of. The paper money ranged from bills that were simply old to a few that were genuinely collectible. When Hargrove added everything up and showed Wren his legal pad, the total was $48,200. She looked at the number for a moment. Then she looked at the 43 canvas bags arranged along the table, each one with its faded paper tag, each one the compressed residue of a year of Earl Fontenot's life. The heavy bag from 2003 and the almost empty bag from 1981, and all the years in between each one. Different. Each one honest about what that year had and hadn't left room for. $48,000, she said. Give or take, Hargrove said. There's some variation depending on what the silver market does, but that's a solid number. She thought about a man who worked as a mechanic in Houma and came home every night to a 30-foot houseboat in a bayou and ate alone and went to bed and got up and did it again. She thought about what 40 years of that looked like from the inside, the discipline of it, the extraordinary, ordinary discipline of it. She thanked Hargrove, and he drove away in his clean sedan, and she sat on the deck of the houseboat and looked at the water for a long time. The hull work began on a Monday. Corbett had a winch system he had built himself out of salvaged parts, a cable arrangement that ran from a heavy beam above the yard and could haul a vessel of the houseboat size up out of the water and onto a set of wooden blocking in the yard. It was not a fast process. It took most of the morning, the cable tightening slowly, the boat coming up inch by inch, the water running off the hull in sheets as it cleared the surface, and the full extent of the damage became visible in the flat Mississippi light of the yard. It was worse below the waterline than above. Above the waterline, the rust was extensive but mostly surface, the kind of oxidation that looks catastrophic, but yields to grinding and treatment. Below the waterline, there was deeper damage pitting that had gone through the surface steel and into the metal beneath. And in two places she could see where repairs had been made. Years ago, sheet metal screwed over holes with what looked like roofing screws. The surrounding steel deformed and stressed from decades of water pressure against makeshift patches. Whoever had done it had kept the boat afloat. They had not done it right. Wren stood in the yard and looked at the hull for a long time, the way she had stood on the dock and looked at the boat on the first evening, finding the logic of it, understanding the system. Then she got the power sander and started. The sanding was loud and dirty and relentless. She wore foam earplugs and a respirator and safety glasses, and she worked from the bow toward the stern section by section, the sander pulling in her hands as the rust came off in ochre clouds and the bare steel appeared underneath. Dull silver at first, almost gray, warming to a brighter tone as the surface cleared. Her arms shook from the vibration by mid-morning and ached badly by afternoon, and by evening she could not raise them above her shoulders without a pulling pain that started at the trapezius and ran down to the elbow. She worked anyway. Corbett came by periodically to look at what she was doing and say nothing or say one short, technical thing and then go back to his own work. He did not offer to take the sander. He did not suggest she take a break. He watched her work the way someone watches a thing they are evaluating, not with judgment exactly, but with attention. After 4 days, the hull was clean, all of it stem to stern down to bare metal. Then came the treatment. She went over the pitted sections with a wire brush attachment on a drill, getting into the deeper corrosion, and then applied phosphoric acid to convert the remaining rust to iron phosphate, a stable compound that wouldn't continue to oxidize. The acid application had to be done in sections timed carefully, wiped off before it overprocessed. It smelled like something industrial and ancient, and it turned the pitted sections a flat gray-black that looked like the surface of something found on the ocean floor. The 2 bad patches where the sheet metal had been screwed on required more serious intervention. She ground out the edges of the old patches, removing the deformed steel around them, cutting back to sound metal. The holes that were left were roughly the size of her hand. She filled them with marine-grade epoxy, building up in layers, each layer applied before the previous one had fully cured, so they bonded molecularly rather than mechanically. Corbett showed her how to mix the epoxy to the right consistency. Like peanut butter, he said. You want it to stay where you put it. She mixed it on a scrap of plywood with a tongue depressor and applied it with a putty knife, building up the surface in careful passes. Corbett showed her how to feather the edges so the patches would flow into the surrounding steel without a visible transition. She did the port side patch. First got it wrong on the 3rd layer, ground it back, and started that section over. Got it right on the 2nd attempt. When both patches were done and cured, she ran her hand over them in the dark with her eyes closed. She could feel a slight difference in texture, but no transition in profile. They were part of the hull. 2 coats of epoxy primer went on next. White, then gray, applied with a roller, each coat left to cure for the full manufacturer-specified time. No shortcuts. The primer went on evenly and dried to a surface that was hard and slightly rough and smelled like chemistry and permanence. Then the paint. She went to the marine supply store in Houma to get the top coat. The man behind the mixing counter had been making custom marine colors for longer than Wren had been alive. He looked at her for a moment when she came in, this 19-year-old girl in paint-dusted work clothes with epoxy on her forearms, and the particular focused expression of someone who has been doing physical work for long consecutive days. "What color?" he said. She had been thinking about this. She said, "The color of water at night, when it's deep and still and there's no moon. That blue that's almost black, but not quite." He turned without a word and went into the back and came out 5 minutes later with a quart can of custom mix paint and set it on the counter and opened the lid with a flat tool. The color was extraordinary. It was the deepest blue she had ever seen in a paint. A blue that contained within it the suggestion of all the blues that had contributed to it. Navy and indigo and the particular darkness at the bottom of a clear lake. It looked like a color that had been distilled from something real rather than manufactured. "That's it," she said. She applied 3 coats to the hull. The first coat went on in the late afternoon of a day when the light was low and golden and the color looked almost purple in that light. She stepped back after rolling the first section and looked at it, and felt something she had not felt since the morning she opened the kitchen drawer and found the folder. The second and third coats deepened the color and gave it the particular depth that multiple layers of marine enamel develop, a depth that is not just visual, but seems almost physical, as if the surface has weight, as if the color goes back into the hull rather than sitting on top of it. When the third coat was dry, Corbett came out of the shop and stood in the yard, and looked at the houseboat hull for a long time. He looked at it the way he had looked at Wren on the first evening when she answered his questions about bilge repairs with that evaluating, attending expression that didn't give anything away until it did. He said, "I have been working on boats for 35 years. I've never seen a first-time hull job look like that." Then he went back into the shop. Wren stood in the yard alone and looked at the midnight blue hull in the afternoon light. Her arms hurt. Her lower back hurt. Her ears rang faintly despite the earplugs from days of sanding. She had dried epoxy under her fingernails that would not come out entirely no matter how long she scrubbed. She looked at the hull, and for the first time since she had pulled the door of her father's house closed, she felt something that was not quite joy, but was in the same family. Something that had to do with making a thing with taking what is broken and treating it seriously enough to fix it correctly with the specific satisfaction of a surface that is now true when it was not true before. She stood there for a while. Then she went inside the cabin of the boat, still up on its blocks in the yard, and she got out her notebook and she opened it to the first page, and she wrote Earl Fontenot's name at the top. She didn't write anything else yet, just his name. She looked at it for a moment and then closed the notebook and set it on the table and went back to work. The cabin came down next. She started with a pry bar and worked her way around the perimeter of the structure, pulling the rotted plywood walls away from the steel frame in sections. The wood came away in chunks and pieces, soft enough in most places that it tore rather than cracked. She filled 3 contractor bags with the demolition debris before the interior walls were gone, and then another 2 with the rotted insulation that had been stuffed between the studs, gray and matted with moisture, and the desiccated remains of insects and whatever had nested in it over the decades. When the cabin was stripped to its steel frame and deck, she could see the bones of it clearly. The frame was sound. The deck was solid. The structure that Earl Fontenot had lived inside for 40 years was at its core still holding together. She rebuilt the walls with marine plywood on the studs, filling the cavities with closed-cell spray foam insulation before closing them up. The foam was dense and yellow-white, and it expanded to fill every gap, every corner, every irregularity in the framing. And when it cured, it was as hard as light balsa and as moisture-resistant as anything she had found in the catalogs. She reran all the wiring, every inch of it stripped out and replaced with marine-grade tin copper wire, color-coded the way Roy Hatch had taught her. Red for positive, yellow for secondary positive, black for negative, gray for AC circuits. She labeled each run at both ends with heat shrink labels. She added a fuse block with labeled positions for each circuit and a main disconnect switch mounted within reach of the companionway door. On the roof, she mounted a single 200-watt solar panel, angled south, connected through a charge controller to a bank of 2 100-amp-hour lithium iron phosphate batteries in a sealed and ventilated compartment she built beneath the bunk. The system was simple and robust and sized correctly for the load she was planning to run. She replaced the propane burner with a new 2-burner unit properly mounted with a regulator and a manual shutoff valve and a flexible hose rated for marine use and a carbon monoxide detector mounted to the ceiling above it, 6 inches from where she calculated the gas would accumulate if it leaked. She tested the CO detector before she tested the stove. The plumbing was minimal and intentional. A 30-gallon freshwater tank mounted beneath the galley counter filled from shore water through a deck, fitting with a hand pump at the sink and gravity-fed pressure. from a small 12-volt demand pump for when she wanted pressure at the tap, a simple through-hull drain at the galley, in the forward corner behind a cedar partition. She framed herself a composting toilet unit properly vented through the roof. She tiled the galley counter in small white hexagonal tiles she found at a salvage yard outside of Houma for $8 a square foot. She grouted them with white epoxy grout that would not mold. She sealed the whole counter with several coats of marine varnish. The exterior walls of the cabin she finished in cedar shiplap, the boards horizontal running the length of the cabin, each one cut to fit and fastened with stainless screws and left to weather naturally. No paint. Just the cedar which would silver gracefully in the bayou air over the years, changing color as it aged, becoming more itself. She built the interior furniture from a combination of cedar and marine-grade birch plywood. The bunk ran the width of the forward end of the cabin, wide enough to be comfortable with 6 deep drawers beneath it on full extension slides. The drawers were sized deliberately, each one the right dimension for a specific category of thing clothes in 2 tools in 1, navigation equipment in 1, miscellaneous in 2. Everything in its place, everything accessible. The table was a drop-leaf design that folded flush against the bulkhead when not in use and extended to seat 2 comfortably when it was. She made the hinges herself from stainless plate she cut and drilled in Corbett's shop, heavy enough to hold the leaf without sag over years of use. The bookshelves were everywhere she could fit them, flanking the bunk above the galley counter along the forward bulkhead in the spaces the drawers didn't reach. She designed them with a small fiddle rail at the front edge, a 1/4-inch lip of wood that would keep books in place when the boat rocked. She filled them with what she had the Chapmans piloting a field guide to Gulf Coast birds, a guide to bayou plants, 2 volumes of marine engineering she had found at a used bookstore in Houma, a worn paperback copy of Moby Dick that had belonged to her mother and had the particular softened spine of a book that has been read more than once. Earl Fontenot's footlocker she placed beneath the bunk, sliding it into the space below the drawers on the port side, where she could see it when she made the bed in the morning. She had cleaned the brass corners with a soft cloth and metal polish until they recovered some of their original warmth. She had oiled the leather straps with saddle soap until they became supple again, the leather darkening and softening the way good leather does when it is properly attended to. She had not replaced anything. Not the original hardware, not the old leather. She had only restored what was there. Inside the footlocker, she kept the folded flag precisely as she had found it, the creases sharp and formal. She kept the letter in its envelope. She kept 1 canvas bag, the one labeled 1979, the year Earl had bought the boat. It was the lightest bag of all the early years. Just a few coins and a single bill. The savings of a man who had spent most of his money on the boat itself and had almost nothing left that year. She kept it empty of its coins, which were with the others she had sold to Hargrove, but she kept the bag itself and the tag, with its faded ink number and the length of twine. She kept her notebook in the drawer nearest to the footlocker within reach from the bunk. It was Odette Thibault who told her about Clara Mayfield. Odette ran a small Cajun restaurant in Houma called L'Agnappe Kitchen, the kind of place that had been in the same building for 40 years and had not changed its menu in 30 and did not need to. She was 61 years old, wide and deliberate in her movements, with silver hair. She wore pinned up and dark eyes that assessed everything they looked at without apparent hurry. She had been Earl Fontenot's closest friend for the last 20 years of his life, perhaps his only close friend. She had begun bringing gumbo to the boat on Friday evenings 2 weeks after Wren arrived, driving out to the yard in a pickup truck with a small cooler in the bed, handing Wren a mason jar of gumbo warm from the cooler, refusing any payment. "You eat that tonight," she said the first time. "You're working too hard and eating too little. I can see it." Wren ate the gumbo sitting on the deck of the boat, which was still up on its blocks in the yard, watching the last light leave the sky. It was the best thing she had eaten in months. It tasted like a place, like a specific set of conditions, like bayou water and time, and the particular heat of a kitchen that has been making the same thing for a very long time. She understood without asking that Odette's generosity was not charity. It was something else, an extension of something that had existed before Wren arrived, a care that had been directed at Earl for years, and now, finding its original object gone, was redirecting itself at whoever was continuing the work he had left unfinished. One Friday in late November, Odette did not leave immediately after delivering the gumbo. She sat on the deck beside Wren in the early dark, and they ate together, and after a while Odette said, "Did Earl write about Clara in the letter?" Wren looked at her. "Yes." Odette nodded slowly. "I thought he might. He talked about her sometimes when he'd had a little whiskey and the evening was long. Not often. Not more than he could help." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Clara Mayfield is still alive. She's 87. She lives in Shreveport with her daughter." Wren was still. Earl knew, Odette said. He kept track of her over the years. Not in any way she would have known about. Just the newspaper sometimes. When her second husband died, it was in the Shreveport paper. When her daughter had children, there was a notice. Earl knew her grandchildren's names. He knew what neighborhood she lived in. He never contacted her. Not once in all those years. "Why not?" Wren said. "Wren." Odette looked at the jar of gumbo in her hands. Because he believed she had a better life without him in it. He genuinely believed that. He thought the damage he carried from the war made him a poor prospect for anyone who deserved more than a poor prospect. He thought the kindest thing he could do for Clara Mayfield was to let her get on with her life and not complicate it with his presence. She paused. Whether he was right about that is a question I have thought about for a long time, and I don't have an answer. I think Earl was a man who understood himself very clearly, and not very generously. He knew his own limitations with great precision. What he didn't always account for was what might have been possible anyway despite the limitations. But he made his choice, and he lived it out with a kind of integrity that I respected even when I thought he was wrong. She looked at the water beyond the yard. "He talked about you," she said. "Not you specifically. He talked about whoever was gonna find that footlocker someday. He was very certain someone would. He said, someone's gonna need that boat more than the scrapyard does. And when they find what's in her, I want them to know it wasn't wasted. None of it." Wren held her jar of gumbo and looked at the midnight blue paint on the hull in the dark yard. The color of it still visible even without much light, dense and present. She thought about Clara Mayfield in Shreveport, 87 years old, living with her daughter. Her grandchildren named in newspaper notices that an old man in a bayou had clipped and kept. She thought about what it means to love someone from a distance for 50 years. whether that love counts, whether a thing is real if it never touches the person it is directed at, whether all those canvas bags saved year by year, labeled with their dates hidden in a bilge on a platform built to outlast their keeper, were a love letter or a monument, or just the quiet record of a man who had found the only shape his life would take. She thought they were all three at once. She ate her gumbo and the bayou settled into its night sounds around them, and Odette sat beside her in the dark, and neither of them said anything more for a while. And the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that two people can share, without either of them having to fill it. The boat went back into the water on a Thursday morning in late January. Corbett ran the winch in reverse, the cable paying out slowly, the houseboat descending from its wooden blocks inch by careful inch. Wren stood on the dock and watched. There was no ceremony to it, no champagne, no crowd, just the slow mechanical process of a vessel returning to its element, the hull touching the surface first at the bow, then settling the water rising along the midnight blue paint as the boat found its waterline. She watched the waterline. It held. The hull sat exactly where she had calculated it would sit, the new epoxy patches submerged and holding the treated steel accepting the water without protest. She had checked the hull twice the previous day with her hands, and a flashlight running her palms over every inch of the below waterline surface, feeling for anything that moved or flexed that shouldn't. Everything had been solid. It was still solid. Corbett released the cable tension, and the boat swung gently on its dock lines and came to rest in its slip, the same slip it had occupied for 40 years. The same dark water, the same cypress trees standing in the shallows on the far side of the inlet, their knees rising from the water like the ruins of something ancient. The boat looked different in the water than it had on land. On land it had looked like a project. In the water it looked like a boat. It looked like a boat that had decided to stay. Wren stepped aboard. She walked the deck from bow to stern, feeling the boards under her feet, feeling the subtle shift of the hull as her weight moved. She opened the cabin door and went inside, and stood in the center of the rebuilt space, and turned slowly. The morning light came through the new windows, larger than the originals, and through the skylight she had cut in the center of the roof. The skylight threw a column of pale January light directly onto the drop-leaf table which was folded against the bulkhead. The cedar walls were the warm yellow of new wood, not yet weathered, still holding the smell of the shavings. The bookshelves were full. The galley counter with its white hex tiles was clean and level. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. She stood in that column of light and felt the boat move under her feet. Just that slow, gentle rocking. The same motion she had felt on her first night lying in her sleeping bag on the bare bunk frame with the bayou sounds coming in through the walls. The same motion, but different now. Because the boat was different. Because she had taken it apart down to its bones and put it back together correctly. And the rocking now felt less like tolerance and more like intention. Like the boat was doing what it was built to do and knew it. She went back outside and sat on the bow with her feet hanging over the water and looked at the inlet. The cypress trees on the far bank had not leafed out yet, the January cold keeping them bare, their branches making a complicated pattern against the pale sky. A pair of wood ducks worked the shallows near the far bank, their movements precise and economical, finding what they were looking for in water that looked uniform to her, but apparently was not. A turtle surfaced in the middle of the inlet, regarded the world briefly, and submerged again without drama. She had been in Homa for 4 months. She had arrived with $1,128 in a coffee can and a backpack and a duffel bag, and nowhere particular to go. She had spent $10 on the boat. She had spent a carefully considered portion of the $48,200 on materials, marine supplies. The solar system, the composting unit, the hex tiles, the cedar shiplap, the wiring, the epoxy, the paint. She had kept detailed records of every expenditure in the back of her notebook. Each line itemized, each amount written in the small, precise handwriting she used for things that needed to be accurate. The remaining money was in a bank account at a branch in Homa. The account had her name on it and her address, which was the slip number at Corbett's yard. The teller who had opened the account, a young woman not much older than Wren, had looked at the canvas bags full of coins and bills with an expression of complete bewilderment, until the branch manager, a Cajun woman named Bertrand, who had apparently known Earl Fontenot, had come out and reviewed the situation with calm efficiency and a great deal of understated respect. "You take care of that boat," Bertrand had said, handing Wren back Earl's letter. He was a good man. Wren had driven back to the yard in Corbett's truck, the one he lent her on days when she needed to run errands, and she had sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before starting the engine. She had looked at the letter in her lap, the careful handwriting, the 3 sheets of plain white paper. She had thought about what it means to leave something behind. Not money exactly, though the money mattered, and she would not pretend it didn't. But the other thing, the record, the 43 bags with their faded tags, the platform built to keep them dry, the letter addressed to whoever finds this, written by a man who understood that he would not be there to see who came, but who believed with the particular faith of someone who has lived long enough to see how things connect, that someone would. She had started the truck and driven back to the yard and gone back to work. Sloan Arsenault had been crawfishing the bayou for 30 years. He was 44 years old and built for the work, compact and deliberate, with hands that looked like they had been formed by the repetitive motion of hauling wire traps from shallow water. He had known Earl Fontenot the way everyone in the immediate community of the bayou knew each other. Not with great intimacy, but with the deep familiarity of people who occupy the same small world for a long time, and whose routines intersect reliably. He had started showing up at the end of Corbett's dock on weekend mornings in February after the boat went back in the water, ostensibly to check his traps in the inlet. But actually, Wren came to understand to observe the progress of the houseboat renovation, with the particular interest of someone who cares about things being done correctly. One morning he appeared at the dock while Wren was on her hands and knees on the bow, recalking the joint between the deck planking and the tow rail, where she had noticed a hairline separation developing. "You fish," he said. "Not yet," she said. "Crawfish. I've eaten them." He considered this. "You want to learn to trap them?" She sat back on her heels and looked at him. "Yes." He came back the following Saturday morning before 6 with a cooler of bait chicken necks in a plastic bag and a half-dozen wire traps in the bed of his truck. He set them up on the dock and showed her each component, the way the trap folds and the way it opens the trigger mechanism, the bait cage at the center. He showed her how to position the baited trap in the shallow water along the bank, what angle, what depth, how to mark the location so you could find it at dawn. "Crawfish move at night," he said. "You want to check the traps early, before the herons figure out where they are." She set 6 traps along the bank that afternoon, wading into the shallows in old sneakers, feeling the soft bayou mud between her toes, the cool water rising to her knees. She marked each trap with a short stake and a strip of orange flagging tape. She checked them the next morning at 5:30 before full light, moving along the bank with a flashlight. Every trap had crawfish in it. Not a fortune, but a real quantity, enough to fill a third of the cooler she had brought. She carried them back to the boat and boiled them in a big pot on the propane stove, with cayenne and lemon and a bottle of the cheap beer Corbett kept in a cooler in his shop. The recipe Sloane had written on a piece of paper and left on her dock cleat. She ate them sitting on the bow as the sun came up over the cypress trees, cracking the shells, with her fingers eating the tails, tossing the rest over the side, where something in the water would deal with it. The crawfish were good. They tasted like the bayou, like the specific mineral character of the water they had lived in, like cayenne and salt and the morning cold burning off. She thought this was the best meal she had ever made, which was probably not objectively true, but felt true in the way things feel true when they are the product of your own effort and your own learning and the particular morning you are sitting in. She set traps twice a week after that. She never took more than the traps could give, without pressure, rotating her locations to let the population recover. Sloane noticed this without comment for several weeks, and then one morning said, "You're rotating them. Most people don't think about that. Most people aren't planning to be here long enough for it to matter," she said. He nodded once and said nothing else. But after that, he began stopping by more often, sometimes bringing coffee, sometimes just sitting on the dock for a few minutes before heading out to check his own lines. He didn't talk much. Neither did she. They inhabited the early mornings on the dock in a companionable quiet that reminded her of the way she had felt in Roy Hatch's marine supply store, the way she felt in any place where the work was real, and the people around her were serious about it. Captain Pelham arrived on a Sunday afternoon in early March. He drove himself, which surprised Wren when Corbett mentioned it afterward, because Pelham was 80 years old and had stopped driving regularly 2 years earlier. He had apparently made an exception. He came in a Lincoln Continental that was at least 20 years old and parked it at the end of the yard with considerable precision, and got out slowly, steadying himself with a hand on the door, and then stood for a moment looking at the houseboat before he walked down to the dock. His name was James Pelham, but no one called him anything but Captain, a title that came from 30 years working the river traffic out of New Orleans before he had retired to Cocodrie, the same small bayou community where Earl Fontenot had been born. He was a tall man who had lost height to age thin now in the way of very old men who were once substantial, the bones visible at his wrists and jaw. His eyes were dark and completely clear. He stood at the end of the dock and looked at the boat for a long time without speaking. Wren sat on the bow and let him look. Finally, he said, "Earl always said this boat had more in her than people gave her credit for." He paused. Same way he felt about himself, I expect. He came aboard carefully testing the boarding step with his weight before committing to it, and sat in one of the 2 deck chairs Wren had set up on the stern. She made coffee on the propane stove and brought it out, and they sat in the March afternoon, the light thin and bright, the water in the inlet very still. And Pelham talked about Earl, not in any organized way. He talked the way very old men talk about the dead in pieces, following memory where it led, doubling back, stopping to clarify a detail, going quiet for a while and then picking up a different thread. Wren listened. She was good at listening. She had learned early that the people who are most worth listening to rarely speak in organized narratives. The real information comes in the pauses, in the corrections, in the details that seem too small to mention, but get mentioned anyway. Pelham talked about growing up in Cocodrie, where he and Earl had been boys together. Earl's father on the shrimp boats. The way the whole economy of that place had been organized around the water, in a way that was inseparable from everything else, from the food and the religion, and the way people measured the seasons. He talked about the summer before Earl shipped out in 1949, 19 years old, full of the particular confidence of a young man who has not yet learned what the world can do to confidence. He talked about when Earl came back. He was quiet for a long time before that part. Then he said, he came back different, which is not a remarkable thing to say about a man who fought in a war. But the particular way Earl was different was that he had gotten very quiet. Before he left, he was not a quiet man. He was present. He was someone who filled a room just by being in it, not loudly, but with a kind of energy that you noticed. When he came back, the energy was still there, but it had turned inward. It was all going somewhere you couldn't see. Pelham turned the coffee cup in his hands. He loved that girl, Clara. Before he left and after he came back, he never stopped. I think he knew that, and I think he found a way to make his peace with it. And I think the making peace with it took him most of the rest of his life. The boat helped. The boat helped a great deal. He looked at the rebuilt cedar cabin, the skylight, the cedar shiplap on the exterior walls. You did good work, he said. He'd be pleased. He came back 3 more times over the following weeks. He didn't always talk about Earl. Sometimes he talked about the river, about the particular character of different sections of the Mississippi, about what it felt like to move that much water through that much landscape season after season for 30 years. Sometimes he just sat and drank coffee and watched the inlet. Wren sat with him and sometimes asked a question, and sometimes didn't. And the afternoon visits settled into a pattern that she found she looked forward to, in the particular way you look forward to something that is both pleasurable and quietly instructive. She wrote things down in her notebook after each visit. Not everything Pelham said, not verbatim, but the shape of it, the details that seemed to matter. Earl's father on the shrimp boats, the summer of 1949. Clara Mayfield at a church social. A man who came back from war with something turned inward that took him the rest of his life to come to terms with. The notebook was getting full. It was Pelham who showed her the grave. He mentioned it one afternoon in April, quietly, as if it were something that had been on his mind, and he was finally finding the moment to say it. He said Earl had a dog. Remy. Big old yellow lab lived on the boat with him for 14 years. Died in 2001. Earl buried him in the cypress grove behind the marina. There's a stone. He said it the way you say something that matters when you don't want to make too much of the fact that it matters. Wren asked if he'd show her. They walked together around the back of Corbett's shop building through the yard, past the boat storage racks and the pile of old outboard motor casings and the stack of marine lumber under its tarp, into the fringe of cypress trees that bordered the yard on the north side. The trees were old growth here, massive, their root systems intricate and above ground. The ground between them soft and dark, with years of leaf accumulation. The light came through the canopy in shifting patterns. The air was cool and smelled like water, and the particular green darkness of a place that does not get much direct sun. Pelham moved carefully through the root systems, testing his footing, and Wren moved with him, not rushing, and after perhaps 100 feet, he stopped and pointed. The stone was flat and gray, roughly the size of a hardcover book, half buried in the soft ground at the base of a cypress root. Someone had cut letters into the surface. The cuts were deep enough to have lasted 20 years of exposure. Still legible, still clear. Remy. 14 years. Good dog. She crouched down and looked at it. She put her hand on it. The stone was cool and slightly damp and covered with a thin film of moss that had been growing there long enough to have become part of the surface rather than something sitting on top of it. 14 years, Earl Fontenot had lived alone on a 30-foot houseboat in a bayou in Louisiana for 40 years, working and saving and putting coins in canvas bags and loving a woman from a distance. He had decided on himself. And for 14 of those years, he had had a dog. A yellow lab named Remy who had slept on the boat and moved through the days beside him, and who had, when the time came, been buried with proper acknowledgement, not just put in the ground, but given a stone, given words. Good dog. Not just a name and a number. Good dog. An assessment. A characterization. The smallest possible eulogy, and somehow, because of its smallness, the most precise. This animal was good. I am stating that for the record. She stayed crouched at the stone for a long time. Then she reached out and broke a small branch from the cypress root above it, a green branch with the feathery cypress leaves still attached, and laid it across the stone. She didn't know exactly why. It felt right in the way that certain gestures feel right without prior deliberation. The body doing something the mind would have approved of if it had thought to suggest it. She straightened up and stood beside Pelham in the filtered light of the cypress grove. He was good company, Pelham said. Remy. He'd sit on the bow and watch the water the same way Earl did. Very calm, very patient. They suited each other. He looked at the stone for another moment. Earl wasn't alone as long as people might have thought, he said. He had the boat, and he had that dog, and he had the inlet and the work. He had Odette, and he had me for the last part of it. People see a man living by himself on a boat, and they think he must be lonely. Sometimes he was. But there's a difference between alone and lonely, and Earl understood the difference better than most. They walked back through the cypress roots to the yard. Pelham got into his Lincoln and drove away carefully. The big old car moving slowly down the road until the trees swallowed it. Wren went back to the boat and sat at the drop-leaf table and opened her notebook and wrote for an hour without stopping. She had been working at Corbett's yard officially since February, 3 days a week at first. Then 4, then essentially whenever the yard was open. Corbett paid her a fair wage and let her use the shop tools and the reference library he kept in the office, a shelf of technical manuals and service bulletins going back 20 years. He said very little about her work beyond the occasional short technical correction. The corrections were always right, and she learned from them without discussion. The customers had started asking for her by name by March. The young woman at Corbett's, she knows her stuff. A shrimper named Trosclair brought in a 22-foot aluminum hull with electrical problems that had defeated him for 2 seasons. Wren spent an afternoon with a multimeter tracing the wiring circuit by circuit. following each run from its source to its termination, checking continuity and resistance at each junction. She found the fault in the third hour, a corroded crimp connector behind the dashboard, where salt water had worked in over years and turned the copper green. She replaced the connector, sealed the repair with adhesive-lined heat shrink, and the circuit worked. Simple when you know where to look, Trosclair said. The knowing where to look is the job, she said. She rebuilt 2 outboard motors from the lower unit up over the spring months. One a fouled-up 40 horse that had ceased from running in water with heavy silt load. One a newer motor that had been improperly winterized and cracked its block from freeze damage. The block repair required fabrication machining a replacement section from bar stock on Corbett's old lathe, a skill she had not had in the fall, and had developed over the winter by reading the manuals and then doing the work slowly and checking it. The repaired motor ran correctly. She tested it in the tank, a 50-gallon drum Corbett had set up in the yard for exactly this purpose, and it ran at full RPM without vibration for 30 minutes. Corbett watched the test run from the door of the shop. He said nothing. He went back inside. She understood by now that this was how he expressed approval. She had stopped needing it in words. On an evening in late April, about 6 months after she had arrived in Houma, Wren sat on the stern deck of the houseboat with her notebook in her lap and watched the sun go down over the bayou. The light came through the cypress branches in long slanted bars, orange and gold, catching the Spanish moss and making it glow at the edges. The water in the inlet was glass flat, the surface so still. It reflected the sky so precisely that it was difficult to determine where the water ended and the air began, whether the boat was floating on the surface or suspended somewhere in the middle of a larger continuity. A great blue heron stood motionless in the shallows at the edge of the far bank. One leg raised its whole body, committed to a stillness that looked less like patience and more like certainty. Like it knew the fish was coming and was simply waiting for the fish to understand that too. She watched the heron. After a while, the heron watched her back, its yellow eye moving to track her position and then settling there, each of them acknowledging the other's presence without alarm. She thought about Earl Fontenot. She had been thinking about him in increments for 6 months now, adding to the picture with each conversation with Odette or Pelham or Sloane or Corbett, each small detail, joining the others, building up the way a portrait builds up when you work from many reference points rather than a single source. She felt now that she knew him better than she had known many people she had spent much more time with. Better in certain ways than she had known her own father. This felt important without being sad. Or it was sad and important simultaneously, the two things not canceling each other out but occupying the same space the way the water and the sky occupied the same space in the inlet's reflection. She opened her notebook. She had been writing Earl's story in pieces for months, not organizing it, not shaping it into any particular form, just writing down what she knew and what she understood, and what Pelham had told her, and what Odette had said in the dark on the stern deck with their gumbo jars. She had been writing it the way Earl had saved his money, one piece at a time. Each piece labeled with when she learned it, letting the whole accumulate without forcing it into a shape before it was ready. She read back through what she had written. It was 37 pages now, front and back, in her small, precise handwriting. It was not polished. It was not finished. But it was real. She could feel that the way you feel when something you are making has developed enough mass to have its own gravity when it starts pulling things toward it, rather than requiring you to push things into it. She was not writing it to publish it. She was not writing it for anyone in particular. She was writing it because Earl Fontenot had spent 40 years putting the evidence of his life into canvas bags and labeling them by year and hiding them in a bilge on a platform built to outlast him. Because some part of him had refused to let his years dissolve into nothing, had insisted on leaving a record even when there was no one specific to leave it for. She was doing the same thing in the medium she had, which was words. She thought that he would have understood this. She thought that he would have found it reasonable. She wrote for a while as the light changed from gold to orange to the deep blue-purple of bayou dusk. The cypress trees went from silhouette to darkness. The heron finally moved, spreading its enormous wings in one slow, deliberate stroke, and lifting from the water and passing low over the inlet, its wingtip nearly touching the surface and disappearing into the cypress grove. She put the pen down and looked at the water. The boat moved beneath her. That same slow, quiet rocking, the hull pressing against the water and the water pressing back, the endless negotiation, the constant conversation between the vessel and the element it chose to inhabit. She felt it in the soles of her feet, and up through her legs and into her chest, the way she had felt it on the first night lying on the bare bunk frame in her sleeping bag, listening to the bayou come alive around her. She thought about what Corbett had said that afternoon, sitting on an overturned bucket outside the shop, drinking the end of the day's coffee. He had said it without preamble, in the middle of a silence that had been going on for several minutes while they both looked at the inlet. Earl came to me 6 months before he passed, he said. Sat right here on this dock. Said to me someone's going to need that boat more than the scrapyard does. You'll know them when you see them. He said it like he was asking me to do a favor, and like he already knew I was going to say yes, which I was. He drank his coffee. I turned away 3 buyers before you came. One of them offered me $2,000 cash. I told him the slip fees had already been settled. Wren looked at him. I told people it was the bilge pump question, Corbett said. That's not wrong. Most people who look at a boat, the first thing they ask about is the cosmetics. How bad is the rust? What would it cost to repaint? They're asking about what they can see. You asked about the bilge. You asked about what's underneath. That tells me something. He paused. But that's not actually why. Earl said I'd know them when I saw them. You came down that bus station parking lot with everything you owned in 2 bags and a coffee can, and you looked at that boat from the dock for 5 minutes before you said a word. You weren't calculating. You were seeing it. I could tell the difference. He stood up and tossed the last of his coffee over the dock edge into the water. Earl said, to wait for someone who needed the boat more than the boat needed fixing. You needed it more than I've seen anyone need anything in a long time. He went back into the shop. She had sat on the dock after he went in and let that settle into her. The idea that this had been arranged not in any mystical sense, but in the most practical one that a dying man had told a living man, to wait for a specific kind of person, and the living man had waited, and the specific kind of person had eventually come down. A bus station parking lot in Houma, Louisiana, with a backpack and a duffel bag, and a coffee can, and the knowledge to ask about the bilge pump. She thought about her father keeping those drawings in the kitchen drawer for 8 years without saying a word. She thought about Earl saving money in canvas bags and building a platform to keep them dry and addressing a letter to whoever finds this. She thought about Roy Hatch mentioning his brother in Houma more than once worked into the middle of other sentences without emphasis the way practical men say the things that matter to them. She thought about how many of the things that had brought her here had looked from the inside like nothing in particular. A job at a marine supply store, a folder in a kitchen drawer, a bus ticket bought in a moment of having nowhere else to go, a question about a bilge pump asked because she had been trained to think about systems, to ask about what's underneath, to look past the surface to the thing the surface was protecting or hiding or simply covering. She thought that this was not luck or not only luck. It was the accumulation of a way of paying attention, applied consistently. Over a long time, the same way Earl's savings had accumulated. The same way her father's silence had accumulated into a drawer full of carefully preserved paper. She picked the notebook back up. She turned to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote he was born in Cocodrie, Louisiana, in 1930. She wrote for another hour. The bayou went fully dark around her, the cypress trees becoming shapes, against a sky that had stars she could see clearly, because there was almost no artificial light this far from town. The propane lantern on the stern rail threw a warm circle of light across the deck, and the page in her hands moving across it. The boat rocked. The water made its sound against the hull, that slow, rhythmic conversation counting something that wasn't time. She did not think about what came next. She did not think about where she would be in a year or what she would do when the notebook was full, or whether the story she was writing would ever be read by anyone other than her. Those were questions for other evenings. This evening she was here on this boat, in this slip, in this particular bayou in southern Louisiana, with the stars overhead and the cypress trees all around, and the water doing what water does. She was 19 years old, and she owned a boat. Not just a boat. This boat. The one that had carried a man a long way without ever leaving its slip. The one that was painted the color of water at night, and smelled like cedar and new epoxy and the bayou. The one with a footlocker beneath the bunk and a folded flag inside it, and a letter addressed to whoever finds this. She had found it. She was here. And for the first time in a long time, here was exactly enough.